Okay, so in this part we're going to look at different types of displays on elements. We're going to take a look at inline block and inline block, which is combined, and we'll take a look at the difference between them, which elements are naturally inline, which elements are naturally block, and we'll look at changing the display type as well, so we can do different things with them. Obviously we'll also look at display none, which basically hides the elements on a page, and that's quite useful for a variety of different things, including if you want to hide something initially and then show it maybe with JavaScript or something like that. So the first thing we're going to do is take a look at which elements are naturally inline and block, and while we're doing that we'll take a look at actually what they mean. So you can see I've got open basically a basic document markup, and I've got a global.css style sheet which will be doing all the styles in. So let's take a look at a basic element like an anchor. So just a link on the page, so if we type click me, go ahead and set the href to hash, we don't need to worry about that. I'm going to go ahead and refresh, and how do I find out whether this is inline block, or display none? Obviously it's not display none because we can see it, but if we just use the element inspector, I'm using Chrome, and we click on the element, you can see that if we go over to the computed styles, you can see that we have a display of inline. So by default this display is display inline, and what that means is it will sit in line with other elements of the same type, or practically other types as well. So if we were to, for example, have another link, and I'll just say or click here or something like that, because these are both inline elements, they will basically sit next to each other. So what about types of block? So we'll take a look at types of block quickly, and then we'll take a look at how they interact with each other, and then changing these display types to style things up. So I'm going to go ahead and create a paragraph. So quite a common element on a page if you were to create a paragraph of text or something. So I'm just going to say this is a paragraph of text. So let's go ahead and refresh and take a look at this. Now you can automatically see, or quite obviously see, that this has come down and it's not sitting on the same lines as them anchors we created earlier. If we look at this, we can already see that by the orange and the blue that this is sitting on a new line. Now the orange outside represents basically the the margin, and the blue area represents the area of the actual element. And because this stretches the entire width of the page, we know that it's a display block. We can already see from the user agent style sheet that it's a display block type. So why is a paragraph a display block? Well, basically when you have a link, let's take a look at sort of refresh this and take a look at an example. So I may type, say, for more information, comma, click here. Now what I want to do is I want to, within this sentence, create a link. So I want the natural flow of the sentence to contain a link, and that's something you often see on different web pages. So because of that, because an anchor is still a separate element, it allows us to contain it within text because it's display of inline. Now if we were to go ahead and change all anchors, just for the sake of testing this, to display block, you can see that this would then fall down, and then the full stop afterwards would fall under that. So if we just inspect this, you can now see that we have the same thing as we had with the paragraph earlier, and we have that blue background stretching the entire length of the page. So that's obviously not what we want, so we'll go ahead and get rid of that. But why are certain elements display block by default? Well, really, it's just a case of what makes sense. So if we have a div, say a container, this could be a header or something like that. You'd probably use header, the HTML5 header element, or nav if it was a navigation item. But just for the sake of it, let's just say div class equals area or something like that. Maybe an area where you might want to go ahead and put a paragraph. So this is a paragraph of text. So it could be absolutely anything. But when we go ahead and refresh, we can now see that we've got the div is actually a display of block as well. The paragraph is a display of block also. Now, we may want to change certain elements depending on how we want them to display on the page. Typically a paragraph, you'd want this to run all the way across the length of the page and go ahead and break anything, or sort of the lines would break down. What you could do, of course, is set this as display inline. Now what this would do is, I mean, you wouldn't typically do this, but we'll look at an example anyway. I could type test here, for example, outside the paragraph element. You can see that that sort of falls down. Now if we wanted to go ahead and for some reason, you probably wouldn't want to do this, again we're sort of doing the opposite of the example we looked at earlier when we changed the anchor element to a display block. What we're now doing is changing the paragraph element to a display inline. And what that does is then it pulls it up, so we've now got a div with the display of block, and we've got the paragraph with display of inline, and that's sitting nicely against the just free-flowing text on the page. So you may want to do that in some circumstances, but it's fairly unlikely. What you would want to do, however, is, for example, if you were styling a button, so hello there. Now let's say you wanted this button to be a specific height, so you want to create a background to this or something like that. So let's go ahead and give this a class of button, and we'll go ahead and target this here with a class. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to say background, I don't know, we'll just give it a background of whatever, maybe a light grey or something like that. Okay, so let's say we want to give this a specific height. So say we always want this particular button to be height of 30 pixels. In fact, let's increase that to 50. When I refresh, you see nothing actually happens. Now, this is because this element is at or has a display of inline. It's an inline element, and therefore it doesn't respect height and width properties. So again, I could say I want the width of this to be 100 pixels, and that's not going to be taken into account. It remains like that. Now we can use things like padding still. We can still say we want the padding maybe to be 5 pixels. In fact, let's increase that again just so we can sort of get this point across. But you can now see that what's happened is the element is sort of being pushed off the page at the top, and that's because it's still an inline element. And it's not a block level element. Now, we want this to respect the outer sort of area of the page, if you like. First of all, this div, and second of all, the body. So let's go ahead and set the display of this to block, and we'll see how this handles. So let's just decrease the padding very slightly, just to actually that should be okay. So let's go ahead and set the display of this to block, and we'll see what happens. Okay, brilliant. So what's happened here is we've got a button now with the height. The height's been respected, the width's been respected, and the padding's been respected. So we'll get rid of the height and width. We know that now we can apply height and width to block elements. Because we've got rid of the width, what's now happened is exactly what happens with paragraph elements, div elements, any elements that are by default a display of block. So now what's happened is it's 100% width of the container, so we could resize the container and this will basically come in. So again, if we look at the computed sizes, we can see here that we have the height 20 pixels and all the defaults, but we've applied some padding here, and that's sort of padded it out a bit. So now we're in a bit of a predicament, because what we want is, ideally, we want to be able to say, I don't know, some text here, and then we want the button next to that text. Now, it might be a case that you do want a nicely styled button to sit next to text. In this case, we'll sort of reduce the padding, just for the example of this, to this. So say we want this to be up here. Now we can go ahead and sort of set this to inline if we wanted. But what might be better is to set this to inline block. Now, beware that there's lack of support, I think, from IE 8 and below, but that basically sort of solves two problems, and it will create an inline element, so it will sit inline, but it will still respect heights, widths, and things like that. Now here, we're not doing heights and widths, but if, for example, I did want to say I want the width to be 200 pixels, or in fact a minimum width to be 200 pixels, that respects that entirely. However, if we were to just have a display of inline, that doesn't, and everything goes wrong. So we use inline block to respect the fact that we can have widths, heights, things like that. So we've now looked at inline block and block, and we sort of understand the differences between them and what styles we can apply to them. However, there's also display of none. So what we can do is we can hide an element using display of none. And there are some considerations here for particularly using screen readers. So for example, if you want to hide something on a page and you want it to be, say, not read out by a screen reader may in fact actually pick this up and read it out to you. But there's a variety of resources you can go and read on accessibility and things like that. There are ways you can get around it with particular screen readers. But basically all this is done is the element still exists, but we've used display to basically say we don't want this to be displayed on the page. Now we're going to compare this to visibility, and visibility is another CSS property, so visibility hidden. Now what's the difference between these two? Well, let's go ahead and get rid of display none and see what happens here. Now what's actually happened is, rather than this being the display type, it's just the sort of it sort of sounds obvious, but the visibility of the element. So the visibility of the element means it's still there, it still retains its same shape, it still exists on the page, and actually exists typically, well, really on the sort of client-facing page that you can see here. However, it's just invisible. So it still gets in the way of things. So we can prove this by putting some text after here. So some text after here or something like that. We can go ahead and refresh now, and you'll see that we've got this gap here where we've got visibility hidden. Now if we swap that in again for display none, you'll see that because it's a display none, it actually removes the element from the page, keeping the markup obviously, so it's still there. So we could go ahead and maybe override this with JavaScript or something and say display inline block, and the item comes back again, and you can see that this is crossed out in here because the style's been overridden, depending on how you do this. So that's basically how we sort of determine the difference between the different display types in CSS, how they're useful.